All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of our COVID question series, looking at the flu of 1918-1919 and comparisons to the current COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Chip Minnemeyer. I'm the editor of the Tribune Democrat. You're here with a great panel, and I'd like to thank our sponsoring organizations, In This Together Cambria, which has been doing a fantastic job throughout this ordeal, University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown, and the Tribune Democrat. The newspaper will be featured a bit in a historical perspective in a few minutes here. But it's my pleasure to introduce our great panelists. First, Judith Levitt, who is a native of Cambria County. Hi, Judith, who attended Westmont Hilltop School District into her senior year. She's now professor emerita at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She taught and specialized in medical history and women's studies, and is the author of numerous books on public health, including Typhoid Mary, Captive to the Public's Health, The Healthiest City, Milwaukee, and the Politics of Health Reform. More on Milwaukee in a bit. Childbearing in America, 1750 to 1950, and several others. Welcome, Professor Levitt. Nice to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yes. Also on the panel, Paul Douglas Newman, who is a professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown, where he has earned several teaching awards, including the National History Channel History Teacher of the Year in 2008. Very nice. He holds a Ph.D. in early American history from the University of Kentucky and is the author of numerous scholarly articles and books. Paul is also a local writer, filmmaker, and actor of stage, screen, and television ads. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
And Jill D. Henning, if you've been watching our series, you're very familiar with Jill. She's an associate professor of biology at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown with a background in immunology, infectious diseases, and cancer biology. She completed her Ph.D. in infectious diseases and microbiology at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health. And she has a postdoctoral fellowship in biobehavioral medicine for a year and then joined the Pitt Johnstown faculty in 2009. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you.
And here's a quick information for our audience members. You'll be able to ask questions to this esteemed panel, and you can do that as we go forward in a couple of ways. If you're on Zoom and you're watching us there, you can put your questions in the Q&A function. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can just type your questions there. They'll be relayed to us. And as we go forward, we will ask those questions that you have for our panel. And now Professor Newman has a presentation that will illuminate the influenza research effort and the work of his team at UPJ and serve as a preview of the rollout of a movie his team developed. That movie will be shown in segments over the next 4 Thursdays, with each release followed by a panel discussion. Paul.
Thanks, Chip. Hello, everyone. Jill asked me several months ago in December, she said that she was working on this project and wanted to find ways to bring theater and acting and maybe film into the project in order to illuminate some of the similarities and differences perhaps between us in 2020 and 2021 and our grandparents and great-grandparents in 1918, 1919. And my first reaction to her was, I said, I think it's a great idea, but I know absolutely nothing about the influenza epidemic of 1918. I'm a scholar of the 18th century. And if she wanted to talk about smallpox in the French and Indian War, I'm your guy, but I don't know much about this. And so she bent my arm a little bit and I said, well, let me look into some newspapers and see what we have in that Johnstown Tribune and the Johnstown Democrat. And I looked very quickly. I picked a couple of dates in the month of October, and I saw that it was just a rich field of information and data to use in order to influence a film. And so at that point, talked to my fellow filmmakers. Here, I'll go ahead and share my screen and start this presentation. My fellow filmmakers, Jason Bollinger and Kate Davis, the three of us have made several short films together. I've written a couple of them now. Jason's a photographer and videographer, editor, and Kate is an amazing local actress, Kate Davis. And so the film that we created is a fictional film about a fictional character that Kate plays, whose name is Kathleen O'Cready Wissenschaft. And she plays this part with a family around her. She has children. She is an Irish-born woman with an American-born German husband. And they have 6 children. They've got neighbors next door. There's people that come and go. But yet she's the only actor. So she is reacting to other people, and you will know what their lines are based on what she says. And that was a very specific choice that Jill made for me. She said, we can have one actor because we're working on a limited budget. We don't have a lot for all kinds of things. And I said, that's fine. You know, we can work with that and we can make something happen. And my first call was to Richard Burkert at the Johnstown Area Heritage Association, because I knew the set that we wanted was the Wagner Ritter House. And Jaha was immediately on board and were incredibly gracious to us for 3 days of filming in March, 3 13 and 14-hour days in order to get the film made. Now, the film is fictional, but it's based on real events in Johnstown that we pulled from the Johnstown Tribune and the Johnstown Democrat from September really of 1918 through the spring of 1919. That was the worst period for Johnstown, was in the fall and early spring, winter and early spring of 1918, 1919. The flu had hit earlier. There's many theories about where it came from. Probably the most respected theory is that it didn't develop in Spain. It developed in Fort Riley, Kansas, and traveled with soldiers to Europe. And then from there overseas through World War I, all the way around the world. The reason Spain got the name was during World War I, as the epidemic was breaking out, all of the countries of the Alliance, the Allies, and the Entente practiced censorship to prevent people in their own countries from knowing about this spread, including the United States. So it was something that, as it started in the spring of 1918, people didn't know it was really traveling and going on. Local authorities started to report on it in the summer of 1918 in Boston and in Philadelphia. And it got so bad in Philadelphia by early September that about half of the doctors and nurses from Conemaugh Hospital got on a Pennsylvania Railroad train and went to Philadelphia to help in the hospitals there that were just overrun. And so that was early September. So these are the newspapers. I knew that we had a very short time window. We didn't get started in this until about the 1st of February. And Jill said, can we have a movie by April? And so I, with her help, rounded up 10 UPJ students, 4 history majors, and 6 biology majors. The history majors, some of them are part of our new program in applied history, public and applied history. And some of them have been involved with other projects that I've had students do. Some of you may have seen, we wrote a book a few years ago for the 80th anniversary of the Johnstown Mountain Playhouse. We also made a documentary film on the same subject that runs on the Mountain Playhouse's website today. Last year, I had students, a number of students, work on an African-American oral history project in Johnstown, and that's something that we're going to be continuing in 2022 once COVID restrictions begin to lift. So I've got a number of just fabulous students who spent hour upon hour cranking through microfilm, and I had to teach them how to use microfilm readers because to them, it is an ancient analog technology, and it is. There's no way to search it. You have to read every page of every newspaper, every headline, and looking for anything that touches on the influenza epidemic. And they had to learn, as they were doing this research, how to generalize and to look beyond just the headlines that had influenza in them. And they became very good at it very quickly. We created we're in the process of creating a database of hundreds of these stories and their dates and the pages they appear on, the headlines, and a short synopsis of each one. And it's from that material, and it's pages and pages and pages of material that I looked through and sifted through and found the points of a story that could provide a narrative arc that would make Spanish influenza and that epidemic accessible to us, but also to connect us to that period 100 years before. One of the things, somebody asked me this as we began the project, is what's it like working on a project like this during the middle of a pandemic? And it hit me as that question was being asked, is that this last year, I have felt, and I know many others have as well, powerless before this thing. As I've seen friends die, another friend right now who is fighting through all kinds of physical ailments after having COVID. It doesn't seem like there's anything I can do about it, and it feels very lonely. My wife and I quarantined with my parents for 4 months. I have elderly parents, and we didn't want healthcare workers coming in and out of their home. So we quarantined with them. And then after that, we formed a bubble with them. And so I didn't get to see my children. I haven't hugged my children since late February of 2020. My children are adults. They're 21 and 26, but they live less than a mile away, and so it's this very lonely experience, has been for me, even though I've been with my wife and my parents. So knowing that this is not the first time in modern history that we've gone through this, and knowing that people went through it and survived through it is a really helpful thing to me. And seeing what they did to survive through it is incredibly helpful. And so I'm hoping that the film and the kinds of issues that it brings up will be helpful to people. It's not an uplifting film. There were no happy endings in Influenza, so be aware of that. But I think there's many moments in it that we can be able to connect with. So what I want to do tonight in the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes, is just show you a very few of the headlines and the stories, and go through some of these main issues that I worked into this fictional story, just to kind of give you a preview, to wet your whistle for what you'll see in these 4 episodes coming up. So here are your mastheads. The Johnstown Tribune and the Johnstown Democrat were 2 separate papers in 1918. The Tribune was a paper that was very much aligned with Cambria Steel and its partner companies throughout the city, and the Democrat prided itself on being more independent. Their coverage of Spanish influenza, as far as I could see, there was really no difference in it. They were both very good about encouraging the public to do everything that they could to stop the spread of the disease. So, first cases are reported in Johnstown on September 23rd, 1918. Many cases of influenza are found in town. Spanish brand of colds seem to be spreading here. Warning is issued. City physician talks. The city physician that's talking is from the Cambria County Medical Society, an organization that was founded in the 19th century and was operating here in 1918. And it was made up of doctors, but also scientists in Cambria County. And they met every month to talk about public health issues. Just a few years before this, in, I believe, 1912, 1913, the county formed a county health board, and the city also created a public health board. And they both had public health managers that looked over all of the kinds of epidemics that they had, because there was diphtheria that was hitting here and there. And there were other diseases that were making their way in. In fact, at the State Archives in Philadelphia, there is a whole file of infectious diseases, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 1911 to 1939. And it's all the records of these public health services that were local, right, from the city and from the county. Some of the things the Cambria County Medical Society did is they met with the mayor, Mayor Frank, and suggested to him a number of things. First, lock down the whole city, stop public meetings, stop people from riding on the streetcars, and to keep people out of crowded places, close down schools, close down church services, all of the closed sporting events. They were serious about this. They planned immediately for building a temporary morgue at Conemaugh Hospital. They saw it coming because they knew what was happening in Philadelphia, and the numbers horrified them. And they also knew that about half of our medical staff was in Philadelphia working, and now all of a sudden the disease is here. So when these calls were made in early October, most of the community responded very well to them. And I think there's a really strong reason why. Here you see the Chamber of Commerce, cooperative in putting down influenza epidemic, has had 1,000 posters printed for distribution in Johnstown. Preventative steps. Those preventative steps include avoid crowded places, wash your hands, right? And another will see, cover your mouth and nose when you sneeze. The reason that early on people seem to be very receptive to these things seems to me to be tied to the second story on this exact same page. Lower Yoder youth killed in action. John Varmecki lost his life fighting in World War I in France, and his parents had just learned of it that morning. The war was still on. The United States government had been asking people to conserve things for the war effort, to work as hard as they could in war industry, to collect materials that the government needed to fight and win the war. And so when this thing hits and public officials start asking people to cooperate, they seem to take it with a sense of patriotism, including what they were blaming the disease on. So influenza may be traced to Hun U-boats, suggestions that germs are brought to this country by submarines. So we can start to see already some similarities and differences between the epidemic of 1918 and what broke out here in 2020. We're not in a wartime in 2020 and 2021. And they were, of course, then. That's a key difference. But yet, immediately, there are rumors about who's spreading this disease, where it's coming from, that someone is doing it purposefully. And of course, last spring, we had that same kind of rumor mongering about whether or not the Chinese had intentionally created or let loose this disease. And there were names attached to the disease that attached it to China and so forth. So this is something we've done in the past, and here you see it happening here. But the war did have many, many positive effects. Getting back to that, the organization that put Americans to work more than any other on the home front to support the war effort was the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross was born from the United States Sanitary Commission that had operated during the American Civil War. It had been that USSC, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, that held fairs. Women sewed bandages, they raised money, they sent care packages to soldiers on the front lines. That was all in the Civil War. The American Red Cross, founded by Clara Barton not long after the Civil War, she had been a member of the USSC, but also had worked with the US Army. Barton's Red Cross got its really first wartime experience with World War I, and it was everywhere. Johnstown had chapters, plural, of the Red Cross, mostly women volunteers, but male volunteers as well. And so here you see an image of a woman collecting money for the Red Cross in a fundraising effort to raise money for materials to send to troops overseas. This is in an advertisement that was for pen traffic for men's raincoats. And so this has nothing to do with raincoats in any way, shape, or form. It's just that pen traffic was trying to attach itself to the patriotism of the day. And a lot of times these Red Cross women would stand outside of the doors of pen traffic to make their collections. But they did a lot more than that. So here's a story from mid-October. Influenza mask is adopted here. Gauze protection to be worn as preventive measure made by local Red Cross. So beginning in October of 1918, the chapters of the Red Cross would hold sewing parties where women who were members would come, and other women were enjoying to do this as well. And they would come together and sew these masks, and then they would be distributed for free at the Red Cross headquarters on Main Street. And here's a picture of a Red Cross nurse in a later article wearing one of these masks, trying to get people to adopt this. And in the article here, Flu Mask Ready to Check Epidemic, they talk about the need to stop the traveling of aerosol particles from an infected person's mouth and nose to your mouth and nose. They knew full well what was transmitting this disease. And you saw the use of masks everywhere, right? The article talks about, it's in Johnstown, that people in Baltimore and Pittsburgh are seen wearing them on the street. They're becoming fashionable items. Different colored cloths were being used and things with patterns on them, right? Same kind of things that we see today. And they were making a pitch, a constant plea to please cover your nose and mouth. and also to wash your hands and to take other steps to keep yourself and your household clean. Now, the Johnstown has its first case on the 23rd of September, 1918. 5 days later, Cambria County held celebrations for the start of the 4th Liberty Loan Drive. So this was a war bond drive. There were 4 of them between 1917 and the fall of 1918. And communities competed with one another to see who could sell more war bonds. Whole counties competed with other counties, states competed with other states. And so the kickoff of this was on September 28th. Every single town in Cambria County had large parades. They had public sing-alongs, public speakers, selling and buying like a public fair, massive gatherings as the disease has just gotten to Johnstown on the 23rd. How'd it get here? Hard to say, but most likely people coming back and forth from helping with taking care of people in Philadelphia came in on the main line. And looking at these papers, you can see everywhere where the Pennsylvania Railroad stopped, you can see that's where the disease begins. And so it's just coming. So they have this event. 3 days later, the entire county is suffering from influenza. These events on the 27th and 28th of September were massive super spreading events, and influenza just absolutely explodes. Now, in dealing with it, the Tribune ran this political cartoon that was developed by the United States Public Health Service and was distributed to newspapers all around the country. And so this is from the United States Public Health Service. Coughs and sneezes spread diseases as dangerous as poison gas shells. Spread of Spanish influenza menaces our war production. U.S. Public Health Service begins nationwide health campaign. And in this article, they talk about all the things that you should do. Stay away from each other. Stay home if you can. Cover your mouth and your nose when you sneeze. Wear a mask if you can do one of those. Wash your hands often. On and on and on. So here is the U.S. government having censored information about the flu for 6 months at this point, now understanding that it can no longer do that. And they're worried that it's going to impact war production and stop the production of steel and guns and tanks and airplanes and the things that we needed to continue fighting. So this is, again, early October. The war ends 5 weeks later, but no one knows exactly when the war is going to end. They're having a Liberty Loan drive to raise more money, to get more production, to keep fighting the war. So people listen to this in October as the war is going on and the disease is first hitting, and the U.S. Public Health Service is asking them to do their part in the war, and they more or less answer that part. Now, there's a dark side to all of this war patriotism. So in the midst of this, as the disease is just hitting, you've had this Liberty Loan drive. This story stuck out to me. It's in the same day, the October 3rd, that the paper is reporting its first mass numbers of deaths in Johnstown, more than double digits, overnight. Would not buy bond, given tar, feathers, and cement also made up coat, given alien, marched through street. So this is a story about Joseph Kashekta, who was an immigrant, still not an American citizen, from Hungary. He was Hungarian. Like many immigrants in Johnstown in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. He hadn't gotten his citizenship yet because he's recently arrived. Who knows how? I haven't found anything else about Joseph Kashekta. But if he's an alien and he's working in the mill, and he is at Cambria Steel, he's down at the bottom of the totem pole. He's probably got a family, and he didn't buy a bond. And so they threw him in a concrete box, coated him in dry concrete, then coated him with tar, which of course caused the concrete to set on him, and then feathers, paraded him through the streets of Johnstown, down Market Street, up Main Street, back Washington Street, back Market Street, till they got back to the front of City Hall, forced him to kneel. And by this time, the crowd was more than 1,000 people, forced him to kneel on the steps of City Hall and kiss the American flag and pledge to buy a bond, right? So this is something that happens to somebody here in Johnstown, and as this epidemic is flailing. We've seen violence committed towards people who are seen to be allied with an enemy that might be spreading a disease, right? You know, there's been a lot of anti-Asian bias and violence in the last year, and a lot from this idea that the flu came from China and that it was a purposeful thing. Well, here this Hungarian, is treated this way in Johnstown in 1918. So the City Board of Health and the County Board of Health both started to act. Rigid orders to prevent an epidemic. All saloons and amusement places will be closed. Prohibit gatherings. Churches may open. Quarantine of Spanish influenza cases established. Instructions coming. So churches may open. This is about the 5th of October, I think. By 2 days later, they came down and said, nope, churches have to close as well. And then all schools, right? So whole citywide and countywide lockdown. By the end of the month, all Halloween parties are to be prohibited. Order of the Board of Health necessitated by the present epidemic. It will be enforced. So here you're seeing that they're really serious about it. And after almost a month, people are getting restless and it will be enforced. Obviously, there's people that are questioning whether or not the Halloween should be canceled, much less church closings and what have you. But have no fear, quarantine will not halt football match. Sound familiar? There were arguments about what should be closed and how long it should be closed and what was dangerous and what wasn't dangerous. And in this article, they're saying that, well, it's an open air gathering, and so it should be safe. That was not the case with influenza in 1918 and 1919, and it's not the case with COVID now. Just because you're in open air doesn't mean somebody standing next to you within 6 feet or within 10 feet, coughing, hacking, and sneezing is not going to infect you. And we've seen that in the last year when, beaches opened up for spring break and all of a sudden cases spike. Being outdoors is better than being stuck indoors. It's better than being in circulated air, but it can still spread. Influenza certainly did. So we also saw immediately, they're not pharmaceutical companies, they were snake oil companies in 1918, trying to come out and sell products to people that told them that they were either a cure for Spanish influenza, which there was none, or that they were a ailments. Did absolutely nothing to help the stop influenza or with anything that would cause it. Capudine, which was a liquid medicine that was essentially liquid aspirin. Liquid quick relief, good preventative remedy for the treatment of influenza, had absolutely no preventative qualities whatsoever. And then you get this company, a company that's selling what's called Hyalumine Oil. And Hyalumine Oil is primarily eucalyptus oil, but it's got a number of other things in it. It's got alcohol in it. Sometimes it had turpentine in it. There's all sorts of things. And they sold a special device that you would heat the oil until it smoked and then inhale it. Picture a crack pipe. That you heat this thing up and you inhale this oil. It smelled like eucalyptus, so it gave you the feeling of opening up your lungs, of course, but it wasn't curing the disease, and it certainly wasn't preventing it. But their advertisements were made to look like news stories. And what's interesting about them is they make so much sense for a couple of paragraphs before they tell you to start smoking eucalyptus oil and turpentine and alcohol, rubbing alcohol. Until then, it sounds reasonable, and they even say, hey, this disease is spread through particles you inhale through the nose and the mouth. And then they say smoking Hyalumine oil will kill the germs in your lungs. And of course, that wasn't the case. And so over the course of the last year, we had a number of things that were being purported as cures that certainly weren't, that were dangerous for people to ingest, inhale, and so on and so forth. So we've been that route before. There were scientists who were working on a vaccine for this flu. In 1918, there had never been a flu vaccine ever developed before. There have been vaccines for many things like smallpox, but also bacterial vaccines to kill bacteria. And so there were several of these bacterial vaccines that were being tested or being used. And there was a virologist who was working on developing a flu vaccine. And out of this, finally, 15 years later, we got our first flu vaccine in 1933. Far too late for the Spanish influenza. But here you see anti-influenza serum is used in local mills. Several thousand employees of Cambria Steel Company inoculated, a preventative remedy. And so Cambria Steel told its employees that if you're going to come to work here, we're going to get this serum and you're going to be injected before you come back to work. And they did it for all their employees. And what that did is it didn't stop a single person from getting influenza, but it did stop some people from dying from secondary bacterial infections that killed a lot of people. Influenza was something that would create other problems in you. And so there are a lot of people that would get Spanish flu and die 5 or 10 days later. And on their death certificate, it would say pneumonia, or it would say a paroxysm or some other embolism, of the lung or what have you, when this was something created by Spanish. If a person had not gotten influenza, they would not be dead 5 or 10 days later or 3 days later. We see the same kind of thing today. People argue about the numbers of COVID victims and whether or not, people would have died anyway, and the numbers should be much lower. And in fact, the case is with Spanish influenza and with COVID, from what I've seen and read, is that our numbers are really larger than what are being reported, not smaller. But anyway, there was resistance to the vaccines, even though vaccines had been around since the 18th century. George Washington, during the American Revolution, required the Continental Army to all be vaccinated for smallpox, every single one of them. And it saved his army. They had been dying of smallpox at Valley Forge. They weren't freezing to death there. And it was after that experience that he made that command and kept his army together and won the American Revolution by keeping his army alive and together. So we've been using vaccines for 140 years by this time, but still in 1918, there was tremendous amount of hesitancy. Part of that, I would say, is because of this. There's a real trust issue that people have with, being sold snake oil. And this is something real that we have to talk about. Our country has been sold opioids as this incredible cure-all for everything by a corporation that sold this into our communities and has killed many, many, many people. So I understand why people are hesitant and not trusting. So this is something I think that's very similar for us today. And we've got to deal with these underlying problems in order to build public trust in the pharmaceutical industry and in our medical industry. So the deaths start to mount in mid-October. More than a score of deaths and hundreds of new cases in the past 24 hours. Frantic efforts to check disease. And here's a story. If anybody's interested, start looking into what happened in Barnesboro and Spangler in October of 1918. It was horrific there. Whole families getting it and dying in a day or two. In Barnesboro, they had 3 doctors. All 3 got in Spanish influenza and died in a week. They had no help. And everyone around them was suffering at the same time, but their suffering seemed to be so much more compounded. And so here, this article, for God's sake, help us. This was the frantic appeal sent to Johnstown today by one of the officials in charge of the influenza epidemic in northern Cambria. Whole families are dying. Scores are dead. There are homes where little children are alone and dying. Fathers and mothers hungry, uncared for, exposed to the dreadful disease. Physicians and nurses and anyone who can help are asked to volunteer, urged to volunteer, begged to volunteer, and to volunteer quickly. Barnesboro and Spangler are virtually helpless in the grip of the influenza epidemic. For God's sake, help us. That came from there. And here you see the plea for aid to whole families ill. It just was just absolutely just terrifying to read. 34 new deaths and more than 400 new cases of influenza. Quarantine is placed over the entire stricken zone. Report shows situation even worse now in northern Cambria. Physicians and nurses strengthen defense against menace, on. And notice that it's always right next to war coverage, right? So the two things that are dominating people's minds are the war and their sons and husbands that are fighting overseas and what have you, and then dying here at home. 32 Cambria employees die within 2 weeks, 24 from influenza and pneumonia. Burial fees set at $100 each. So Cambria Steel was having a heck of a time. This is why they were forcing everyone to get that serum. And it just kept rolling in waves. You'd see a week or so where the lockdown would work and people would stay home and go inside and numbers would start going down. And then all of a sudden people would start going back out. And in November, it would come back up again. You know, so you went from 400 cases in a day to mid-October to Halloween, where it went down to just over 40, to right before the armistice in the second week of November, back over 639 cases in a week. Health authorities believe yesterday's report is only partial, right, with more. Quarantine guards out yesterday, Saturday crowds control. So the Public Health Service got Mayor Frank to enlist a voluntary corps of deputized people with badges to make arrests and to fine people for violating lockdown and for violating quarantine. So lockdown is you can't go into this restaurant, you can't go to this sporting event, you can't go to church, you can't go to school. Quarantine guards were policing that, but also people who had been identified, and the paper started printing the names and the addresses of every case of every person who was identified with influenza in mid-October. And so neighbors started reporting on neighbors. I saw so-and-so out on the street, and they go and either put them back in their home, but they would write them a fine, you know, and after the disease passed, they could be prosecuted. And there were stories about how they were dealing with these courts because they had to shut down the court at one point because they didn't want everybody coming into the court, right? So this is something that's much more extreme than what we've been through. We haven't had this level of policing. We've had recommendation after recommendation. I remember when it first started, I wondered, are they going to shut down transportation between states? Will they shut down the roads to keep us from going from Pennsylvania to Maryland or what have you? And I worried I wouldn't be able to get to my parents. And that's why I drove to Virginia and lived with them for 4 months, because I didn't want to be separated from them. I wanted to take care of them, you know. Didn't get that far here, obviously. So here is a difference that would happen. Mayor to ask the United States for help, declares physicians in army camps are badly needed in Johnstown. And so there are army camps around the country. The bad idea about doing that is the army camps were the places where the disease was worse. So one of the major points of embarkation to Europe from Johnstown and places of debarkation coming back for Johnstowners was Camp Devens, Massachusetts. And they got the flu in late August. By October 1st, they had 20,000 cases of flu, and many of them were Johnstown boys. And they were being sent home to Johnstown, sometimes with the flu, just to get them out of the army camps. And so this thing started to spread, you know, even more that way. Quarantine of hotel ordered. City health officials take drastic steps in Cambria City case. Others are coming. It was the European Hotel down in Cambria City on Broad Street. And it had been ordered to be shut down, and they had a basement door, and they were sneaking people in the basement door, and they were coming and going and coming and going. And then so the quarantine guards shut them down. Protests at closing of churches. So these articles right here, quarantine of the hotel, and this come after the armistice. It's in the 3rd and 4th week of November that the war ends. And the pleading for people to do what's asked for the war effort has come to an end. And the resistance to lockdowns and to shutting things down and what have you starts to rise as the war ends. And I think there's a connection between those two things. And here too, this is an interesting article because the churches had been shut down, but they had started bringing kids back to school right before Thanksgiving. And so there was a group, an ecumenical group of many, many different church leaders who came together to complain to the city and the county board of health, because the county board of health was telling people to do one thing and the city was telling them another. And they were trying to get in the middle of that and say, well, you should let us open our churches back up. If these kids are going to school, we should be able to have our churches. Perhaps the question should have been, why are the kids going to school when there's still 700 cases a week and people are dying at a rate of about 9% was the death rate. 8 have influenza in Morelville. Here we're moving into 1919. 1 child also has diphtheria. Record shows influenza totaled 4,373 cases here. This is in January. So from the 1st or September 23rd to very, very early January, like January 4th or 5th. Here's another one from the Democrat. 4th death in the lupus family since Saturday. Mother and 8 other children now have influenza and are patients at Memorial Hospital. They came here from Mexico. So Cambria Steel could not get enough people to work in the mills if they just relied on Johnstown. And so in 1917 and in 1918, they sent agents into the American South, and they brought up African-American workers from Alabama and Mississippi and other points of the South, but also they brought in Mexicans to work in the steel mills. And so this was another community coming in, and here the Lupus family had 4 deaths in just a couple of days. Here's one from a whole family that was dying in Walnut Grove, the Frazier family. 3rd death in 3 days, mother, father, and child, and they were gonna have a triple funeral. And they reported here that 2 children were left alive, a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. The 3-year-old died the next day. I don't know, I didn't see anything about the 6-year-old. And I believe that child may have survived. So the question is, what happens? And I'll get to that in a second. So here, influenza causes coffin scarcity. This is how grave things got. They were having trouble burying their dead. Because they just didn't have the facilities to take care of how many were dying and how many people were sick, with everyone getting sick at the same time. This is the kind of thing that happens in epidemics. It happened with the bubonic plague. It happened with smallpox epidemics throughout Europe and throughout Native American communities. This type of influenza, people got sick within 24 hours of exposure, and they were deathly ill within 24 hours after that. And sometimes whole groups of people, whole families would get sick at the same time, and no one could take care of each other. And they were, of course, dealing with dehydration, and no one could get up there bringing water for everybody else. And so part of what was causing this death was a rapid dehydration that comes from influenza, like smallpox would do the same sort of thing. And the lungs were just, filling up with fluid, and what they needed was constantly intake of fluid to fight that, to be able to expel fluid from their bodies. And when everybody's sick, you can't do it. Public funerals were prohibited by order. You could have a graveside service with no more than 10 people attending, but no other funerals were allowed to be had. Many flu orphans are created. By March, 800 children in Johnstown had been orphaned. And taking care of those orphans, we didn't have public services to take care of any of this. There were no social safety nets in 1918. There was no unemployment for the people who lost their work. There were no benefits coming from the government. There was no, influenza relief package giving people checks. There was nothing in terms of social services that were really available to people or to these orphan children. So it would be the YWCA that would step in to take orphan children and try to place them if there were no families to take them, or to take healthy children out of diseased homes to keep the children from getting the disease. So this was a tremendous effort by the YWCA in order to combat the disease. And last, I'll just leave with this article. Pointed out a lot of things, but this is just scratching the surface. This is one thing I'm really proud of. It came out of the Johnstown Tribune, and it's an article that we use in the very last episode of our film, and it's called Teamwork. And let me blow it up here a little bit for you. It's really amazing to read. Teamwork. If Johnstown is to wipe out the epidemic of Spanish influenza, we must have teamwork. It takes teamwork, better teamwork, to successfully combat good teamwork. Remember, it is not a single germ, it's a whole lot of germs, millions of germs, which caused the terrible epidemic, which is sweeping over Johnstown and the rest of the nation. The germs have done the damage by teamwork. Remember that it is not what one Johnstowner or a small number of Johnstowners do in precaution that is going to damage the flu germs. It's what thousands of Johnstowners do by teamwork. The health authorities are telling us what to do to check this disease. If we do not all obey, if we do not all put into practice the things we are told, and the germs continue their concentrated attack and the use of teamwork, the epidemic is going to spread. But if everyone obeys the regulations, the precautions, and puts into practice by teamwork, all these things, the flu front is going to crumble. Now's the time to strike, for everybody to strike all together. Teamwork. And with that, I'll finish and turn things over to Dr. Levitt.
I thought Chip was going to go next.
Well, actually, yeah, I mean, we're going to transition to Dr. Levitt, and very interested to hear, in addition to what Paul has just taken us through, your thoughts about the 1918-1919 influenza, and particularly your case study of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which you call a success story in terms of responding to a major health crisis. So we will shift now to Judith. Thank you, Paul, and hear from Judith. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I found the Johnstown story very interesting. I look forward to the movie. And one of the things I think it's really important to hear the Johnstown story and the Milwaukee one, which I'm about to tell you, is because public health was local in 1918. The US Constitution had left to the states the responsibility for preserving and protecting the public health. Some of those states authorized cities to do it by themselves, and other states kept the authority for themselves. In Milwaukee, the Wisconsin Board of Health had given the city its own authorization, and it could do what it wanted to do. So what I want to do very quickly, because a lot of it is really what we saw in Johnstown from Paul's account. I want to say how Milwaukee did it. And Milwaukee was really the second most successful city in the country for dealing with this 1918 epidemic. I want to know how they did it. I want to know what they did. And then I want to give you a little bit of context to understand those first two things. So how did they do it? How did they have such great success in Milwaukee in 1918? And the answer really is fourfold. One was a public-private coalition, and that was built from day one. The health commissioner appointed an advisory committee of 2 business people and 2 physicians. And he did not make a move the whole rest of the epidemic without consulting the 2 of them. So he kept the business community and the medical community on his side, and he got feedback from them and decided what to do because of them. He also sought extra money from the Common Council so that he could get the hospitals up and running and ready to deal with the sick who were going to come. And also very important, and maybe this is from Paul's teamwork that we learned this, he activated voluntary organizations, the churches, civic clubs, women's groups, all the voluntary clubs and associations around the city were contacted by the health department and brought in to be active during the campaign. And I think probably most important about how they did it was to keep constant communication open, to teach people how to avoid infection. They used multiple language. Milwaukee was a heavily immigrant city in 1918, and they put out everything in German, Polish, and in English, and in Yiddish also. In newspapers were very important to the health department to get its message out. Churches and factories ran what they called 4-minute talks, which were when the health department would come to the workplace and try to teach people how to avoid infection. And the health commissioner himself met personally with physicians, clergy, business people, theater managers, newspaper editors, club representatives daily. Now, not everyone daily, but he met with some of those people every day to try to keep the communication open. So everyone in the city knew what he was doing and why he was doing it. So what did the health department do? Again, very similar in many ways to Johnstown. They outlawed public gatherings immediately. Always remember, with the consultation with the business community and with the medical community. They insisted that people wear gauze masks in public. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. They closed theaters, movies, public dances, churches, schools. And later, when the epidemic began to wane a little bit, they allowed half capacity in those places. Saloons, interestingly, were left open, but only open for takeout. So you could go in, you could buy a drink, and you have to drink it outside. So we're aware of takeout today a lot. The churches did complain that saloons were allowed to be open and churches weren't at all, but they went along with it nonetheless. The health department also organized visiting nurses associations, the Red Cross, teachers, and women's organizations to staff city hospitals and clinics. The teachers, of course, were idle when the schools were closed, so they could be enlisted to go into clinics, wash dishes, wash clothes, help the nurses and doctors in the clinics and hospitals. Now, I want to turn to the context a little bit because I think it's very important, and this is really one reason that local places are very important to understand, because context differs from place to place, from city to city. Now, war mobilization was constant throughout the United States. When influenza hit communities everywhere, they had already been on some level mobilized for the war effort. And this helped enormously because the machinery was there and the health department could easily plug into it. In Milwaukee, that mobilization helped throughout the influenza epidemic. Unlike what Paul said in Johnstown, people, once the war was over, people really changed their tune a little bit. I did not see that in Milwaukee at all. The Liberty Bond parades are very interesting that you mentioned. Also, Milwaukee did not have any during the time of the influenza, but many cities did, and it was always connected to the spread of, I was going to say COVID, the spread of influenza. Philadelphia is most known for this problem because Philadelphia had one of the biggest Liberty parades ever during the influenza outbreak, and the city, the disease was spread terribly. The city was very, very hard hit, and a lot of it was directly related to the Liberty Bond parades. Now, Milwaukee had a specific history that was very important in how well it did in 1918. And one part of that history was that Milwaukee had suffered a smallpox epidemic. And it was an epidemic that the health department had tried to handle the way every health department did, with vaccinations and with isolation of the sick, and taking children to an isolation hospital, or adults for that matter. And they did it in a very bad way in terms of not communicating with people about why they were doing it. They would just arrive at somebody's house and take the child away from the mother. It was a very insensitive kind of experience. And as a result, the south side of Milwaukee completely rebelled to the smallpox epidemic and rioted in the streets for a week, every day for a month. There were riots in the streets, smallpox riots, to try to resist the health department. Well, the health department by 1918 had learned a lesson from that. And that was that you have to communicate. You have to tell people why you're doing it. You have to speak in their language. And that's very important to a successful public health campaign. And so that's what they did in 1918. They very consciously did not make the same mistakes that they had made before. There was another very specific context to the 1918 influenza outbreak in Milwaukee, and that was the political coalition that had been built starting in 1910 in the local government, a coalition of middle class and labor, a coalition of good government, by which they meant clean, transparent government, and it replaced a government that had been known for its corruption. And starting in 1910, the city government was very different and very clean and transparent. And it also had citywide health programs going on, which were already still continuing in 1918 for infant welfare, community clinics, and the like. And so when the health department needed to deal with influenza in 1918, they had this network already established throughout the community of community clinics, all run by experts. They were very big on relying on advice from experts, this good government from 1910. So the health department, as we see now, was laced with pathways to voluntary organizations and community members. It had a stable base that had been built very consciously on public and private input, and on which that stable base, the community was able to build its defense against the flu. So trust and cooperation, trust, as Paul talked about a lot in Johnstown, trust and cooperation, extremely important to successful influenza fighting. Strong leadership with a very clear message that was communicated clearly through the newspapers and all the media, and a strong connection to the community, and an awareness of its own history and how to build on that history and learn from that history. So we see, by contrast, the COVID experience has been quite different. COVID arrived in our country in a time of a relative low point in public trust in science, in public trust in government, and a diminution, a big diminution of financial support for public health. And all of that played into how our country responded. Now I want to just one more minute to talk about masks, because masks were used in both 1918 and 2020, and they had very different meanings, and they were very differently in terms of dealt with differently in terms of being effective. So today we know that masks have become very political, that one of the political parties really they don't want to wear masks. They don't think they're important. They don't believe that science has given a clear message about masks, and they don't think that they're effective. The interesting thing is today, we do know that masks are effective in spreading, in stopping the spread of the COVID virus. In 1918, people were very willing to wear masks. It was seen as a patriotic duty during the war and after. And yet the masks themselves in 1918 were probably not very effective, because they were gauze, they were very porous, and most of them were handmade and probably not made very well to begin with. So masks, you can't just say, I think that we see that masks are a parallel with 1918 today, and then they have very different meaning and very different valence in our culture. But I think public cooperation and trust are just as important today as they were in 1918, and they were very important then. So thanks.
Thanks, Judith. Thank you very much. I mean, we do have a question from the Q&A that I'll ask you since you're still on. This person asked, did what happened in Milwaukee lead to the election of socialist mayors or officials there? What was the political fallout?
Well, that's the 1910 government that I was referring to, which was a socialist government in part. It was a coalition government. The mayor was a socialist who was elected in 1910, and another socialist mayor, again starting in 1916, really for the rest of the first half of the 20th century. So yes, the socialists were very present in Milwaukee, but the government that came in and did what I was talking about was really a coalition government with progressives, with labor unions and labor movement, and with Republicans. So it was a very progressive political coalition that included the socialists. The socialists at that point, and Milwaukee in any case, were a very pragmatic group, and they didn't feel that they needed the label as much as they needed to get the city well organized and well run. But yes.
Great, thanks. I mean, and would remind folks in the audience, we're up past 8 o'clock and we'll probably go a little bit longer because we have such great information. But if you have a question, now's the time to get it on there, either on Facebook Live or on the Q&A for Zoom. Jill, do you want to kind of take for a couple of minutes, talk about the science side of Spanish flu and kind of what you've seen there?
Why, sure. So as we've been talking about the comparison this evening and some of the things that have happened, we've also seen some comparisons with the disease itself. Spanish influenza, or the 1918 pandemic, did come in about 4 waves. It took a span of approximately 2 years to rid itself or to burn itself out from a pandemic, so to speak. And we, many people in the scientific community, believe that we here in the United States are on the precipice of the 4th wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are seeing some similarities in that regard as well. There are major differences, however. It is believed that the 1918 influenza pandemic was about 500 million people, whereas to date we have over 142 million individuals with COVID globally. So we are seeing less people infected, and hopefully that is because we have learned some lessons over time with public health. But there are a lot of differences between them scientifically. Influenza primarily affected younger individuals, and the primary age group was 25 to 40, whereas with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, it primarily affects older individuals, 65 and older, and then those with pre-existing conditions. So we are seeing some differences in the science based upon it, but the one big thing is that influenza, regardless of whether it's Spanish flu or bird flu or H1N1 or H5N2, doesn't matter which flu it is, the incubation period for influenza is 1 to 2 days, whereas the incubation period with COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 is 5 to 7 days and can be as long as 14 days. So in those time periods, you can infect more people. So what we call that infectious rate, or that you may have seen the reproduction number, things coming out where you're saying, how many people can I infect if I'm sick and I meet up with others? With influenza, or with the 1918 pandemic, it was around 2.5. So one person was likely to infect 2 to 3 people. With SARS-CoV-2, one person is likely to infect 4.9 or almost 5 people. So there's a big difference in the spread that we see with these 2 different kinds of viruses. So keep all of those things in mind, and let's just keep working on that teamwork and hope that we can use this information to learn from the past.
I guess for any of the 3 of you, anything that you heard from your colleagues this evening you wanted to respond to, or you wanted more elaboration on? We'll give a couple seconds for the group to kind of interact, if you will.
I'm fine.
All right, we're good.
Paul, I think is trying to talk, but his mute is on.
Sorry about that.
It's all right.
I was trying to keep the sound down that was outside in my street. I think it's interesting that that Johnstown and Milwaukee react a little differently to one another over time. That resistance develops here and less so in Milwaukee. And it could be that communication factor. The Cambria County Medical Society was constantly pushing the mayor, but the mayor was caught between a city health board and a county commissioner of public health that seemed to be at odds with one another. And I wonder if it's that conflicting messaging, and that the mayor felt caught in between, and if that's what led to the cracks that allowed resistance to kind of work in like a weed and spread the cracks even farther. It sounds to me like Milwaukee did a better job of communicating well together and prevented.
It could be. I don't know how the Pennsylvania State Board of Health dealt with giving the authority to various cities
Right.
or counties. So that
Yeah,
might be-
and I saw that too, where the city and county were arguing with things that were coming down from Harrisburg.
yeah. Well, Harrisburg had the authority, so
Yeah.
if they didn't give it, they had it.
Well, yeah,
Whether they
yeah.
used it or not is another issue.
Yeah.
There's one other factor that I think is relevant in terms of the comparison, and that is that the influenza swept through a community much more quickly and was gone, at least for a while. The first wave might have lasted 2 or 3 weeks, then it was gone for 2 or 3 weeks, then it came back for another 2 or 3 weeks, so that when things were closed, they were closed for 3 weeks perhaps, but not for a year like we're experiencing. And
Mhm.
so the experience in that sense is very different. And it's because of the virus differences, what Jill just was telling us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, folks?
Watch
Paul,
the
can
movie.
you remind us, I'm sorry, I was gonna say, can you remind us of what's coming the next 4 Thursday evenings and just so
Yeah,
everybody can
yeah.
check
Watch the
that?
movie on Thursday. So Thursday at 7:00 on In This Together Cambria's YouTube page and their webpage. That will be episode 1. There are 4 episodes. They're all between about 8 and 10 minutes each. When we're finished showing them all over the course of the next month, we will do a full movie cut and make that available so people can watch it in one 35 or so minute episode. And then we'll find ways to get it screened around the area this summer. Hopefully you'll be seeing a lot of opportunity to see it.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thanks to In This Together Cambria for all you've been doing, including this movie series that we're about to experience. Thanks so much, Judith Levitt, Cambria County native and a retired professor at the University of Wisconsin. Thank you, Paul Douglas Newman, professor of history at UPJ, and Jill Henning, professor of biology at UPJ. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. We thank the University of Pittsburgh and Johnstown again for hosting this forum. And we will see you again, I believe, in a week to talk about higher education and the impact of COVID on that area. So thank you all very much. Stay safe. And I hope you found this as interesting as I did.
Thank you.